Thank you so much for joining us for our third, I think, Meet VC Authors event this year at the Humanities Research Center. My name is Christina Stanch. I'm a professor of English here at VCU, and I direct the Humanities Research Center. I have a wonderful team, Ellie and Hillary, who have helped me prepare this event, and I'd like to thank them as well. And before we get started, as people gather, I just wanted to put some events on your radars. You know me, I always, I always have something to share, but we are really excited to share our new website, which just launched. Ellie will put a link into the chat, as well as our second Humanities Week in October. We celebrated our first last year, as we also celebrated the center's 10th anniversary. And then this year we have our second. Lots of great events prepared for you, including on Friday of that week, several walking tours organized in partnership with the Valentine Museum in Richmond. And they're all free and open to the public. So we hope everyone takes advantage of them. Finally, before I introduce today's esteemed speaker, if you do not already receive our HRC newsletter, you can sign up at the link in the chat. And Ellie, please, and thank you so much for posting it. Welcome to Meet VCU Authors today. As many of you know, this series invites colleagues and students from VCU and from other universities across the world, really, to meet VCU authors as they talk about their publications and as they field questions about their work, take great comments, and really engage with our students, faculty, and staff. And because of our continued success with the webinar format, our attendees hail from many states in the United States and from abroad. And in fact, today's speaker hails from Qatar, so from VCU Qatar. And we have speakers tuning in every week, every other week when we host Meet VC authors from all over the world. This is also a time of celebration because publications take many years to complete, as most of us know. And so without further ado, I will just mention that our virtual events follow more or less similar format with a brief introduction of our speaker, who will then take about 35 to 40 minutes to introduce their work, and then with ample time for Q&A. And as you listen in, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A function or in the chat as they come to you, and we'll field them in the order in which we receive them. Now, it is my absolute pleasure to introduce our colleague from Doha, Dr. Matthias Determann, professor in the Department of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Virginia Commonwealth University in Qatar. Dr. Determann is also, among his many functions and the many hats he wears, he's also an associate editor of the Review of Middle East Studies and the book review editor of the Journal of Arabian Studies. He holds a doctorate from the University of London and 2 master's degrees from the University of Vienna, one in history and one in Arabic studies. He's the author of 5 books by my count, but I could be wrong, including the book he'll be talking to us today about, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Astronomy, as well as others titled Islam, Science Fiction, and Extraterrestrial Life, The Culture of Astrobiology in the Muslim World, and Space Science and the Arab World, Astronauts, Observatories, and Nationalism in the Middle East. He's currently completing a book about the history of teaching science with science fiction, and he has been a terrific attendant of our previous Meet VC authors this year and in the past, so thank you so much. As a side note, Dr. Determann and I met in person last December at the NERA Award ceremony at VCU. It was an honor to share the stage with you, and I'm so delighted that you accepted our invitation to share your work with us today. Dr. Determann, congratulations on your recent book, and welcome to Meet VCU Authors.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a great honor and pleasure. Wonderful. Let me share my screen. Aber So it gives me a great pleasure to talk to you about One Planet, One Sky, Internationalism in Astronomy. Just like Andrew Crislip, our first speaker in the series, I essentially want to focus on one chapter of the larger book. The larger book that Christina kindly introduced us to us is about diversity, equity, and inclusion in astronomy. The book talks about essentially the history of activism, social activism in astronomy, talks about gender, talks about race, talks about disability, but various areas of activism and identity. And the part that I would like to focus on in particular has to do with activism surrounding nationality, astronomers crossing borders, and so on. So I mentioned my work is in part about identity politics as well. So I should share something of my own identity. I'm living in Doha, Qatar. I'm originally from Germany. I also partly grew up in Austria. I also studied, as Christina mentioned, in the UK. So I've lived in different countries. And also part of my identity is I'm also a Trekkie. So a Star Trek fan. I was born in 1984. So that's something that you can remember easily because I'm a science fiction fan. And so 1984 is perhaps one of the most famous titles and years in science fiction. So these are the shows that I grew up with. And by the way, can you sort of see the Star Trek shows here? Wonderful. So I grew up primarily with Star Trek, the original series, then Star Trek, The Next Generation, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, and Star Trek Voyager. The title here is Infinite Diversity and Infinite Combinations. That's a philosophical statement that is ascribed to the Vulcanians, so the species of Spock. And I think Star Trek in many ways sort of embodied the various diversity, just in terms of what we can see here with the crews, right? In the very first original Star Trek show, you had people of different national and ethnic backgrounds, right? There's somebody of a Russian background, Chekhov, working side by side with American colleagues in a show that was produced during the 1960s, so perhaps at the height of the Cold War. And since then, we've had people of various skin colors, humans and non-humans, and even androids, all sort of exploring the universe peacefully together as part of a united federation of planets. I'm mentioning this because this has inspired me, but it has also inspired many, many astronomers and space explorers that I've talked about. Many people who became astronauts cite that they were inspired by shows like Star Trek. And those people, among those people who did not make it as astronauts, many of them stayed on Earth, but at least became astronomers, astrophysicists, and worked in that area close to space. I'm interested sort of in astronomy when it comes to looking at diversity, not just sort of because Star Trek really in many interesting ways explores diversity, but also because astronomy in many ways sort of has an inherent tension between inclusivity and exclusivity. So the inclusivity is that, well, the sky does not belong to anybody, which means it belongs to everybody. We have knowledge of the sky, learning about the sky, names for objects in the sky, in probably every human culture since the beginning of time. And there are many scholars who've looked at, for instance, cultural astronomy in all parts of the world. People like Jarita Holbrook, she has studied African cultural astronomy. And sort of there are many people who've looked at Canadian First Nations names for stars, or Aboriginal Australian names, right? So the astronomy is really a science, a domain, a field of learning, a field of human activity that is shared by everybody who has ever looked up to the sky and wondered and told stories about what's up there. On the other hand, astronomy, modern astronomy, is also very close to astrophysics and thereby close to physics. And physics itself had a very close alliance with the military-industrial complex. So many sort of space-related technologies are dual-use technology. You can use a rocket to put a man or a woman on the moon, but you can also use a rocket to hit your neighbor. You can use satellites for civilian purposes, but you can also use satellites for military and espionage purposes. And this, for instance, is documented in a book by Neil deGrasse Tyson, one of the most famous contemporary astronomers, who wrote about the unspoken alliance between astrophysics and the military. And the book is dedicated to anybody who ever wondered why astrophysicists have jobs at all. Sort of, he argues that because astrophysics is useful to the military. This tension you can sort of also see in Star Trek. So if you look at the United Federations of Planets, which represents a united humanity in space, you can see how this is modeled after the flag of the United Nations, which has a committee on the peaceful uses of outer space. If you look at the Starfleet emblem, so Starfleet, that's the exploration arm of the United Federation of Planets, for those of you who are not Trekkies, but it's also kind of a military arm too. So the Starfleet officers are sort of military officers with sort of military ranks like commander, lieutenant commander, and so on. And sort of if you look at the emblem itself, on the one hand, it sort of is quite similar to the NASA logo, and NASA, which at least until maybe this month was predominantly a civilian entity. I think Trump recently sort of changed the mission of NASA somewhat. However, the Starfleet logo is also very, very close to the logo of the United States Space Force, which as of this summer is part of the Department of War, right? No longer the Department of Defense, but the Department of War, and sort of within that, the Department of the Air Force. So even in Star Trek, right, we see sort of the military and civilian, the inclusive, the exclusive aspects coming through. If you ever wondered whether it was a coincidence why these logos seem so similar, but well, I advise you to look at the book Inspired Enterprise, how NASA, the Smithsonian, and the aerospace community helped launch Star Trek in the 1960s. That's a book that just came out. So my talk is about internationalism, but the larger project is also about sort of the history of activism in astronomy across different domains, including gender. There are other books about women astronomers, and well, humans have always looked up at the sky and wondered what's out there. So of course, women representing half of humanity have always also done so. Like Star Trek 2, to a certain extent, has sort of explored various gender identities and sort of has served as inspirations for astronomers. So Catherine Janeway of Star Trek Voyager, for instance, has been cited by various astronomers as being a model of like female leadership, for instance. There are also like various other like non-binary forms of identities that have been explored in Star Trek, for instance, through the figure of the changeling Odo, who sort of can take on female forms as well as male forms, in some ways a a trans figure par excellence. Racial and ethnic minorities. Again, we've had many Black astronomers, Hispanic astronomers, astronomies of various identities in the United States. And some of them have also been inspired by Star Trek figures, notably Lieutenant Uhura from Star Trek. And another sort of category of identity, another focus of activism that I've looked at have been disabled people. Star Trek sort of has been inclusive of those identities as well, sometimes in intersectional form. So Star Trek The Next Generation featured a blind African American, Jodie LaForge, played by LeVar Burton. There's also an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation that featured Stephen Hawking, perhaps one of the most famous disabled scientists, and probably one of the most famous scientists who never won a Nobel Prize. Stephen Hawking is also one of the few people who've ever played themselves on a Star Trek episode. And there is more research recently on like deaf astronomers, blind astronomers in history. And sort of in my work, I really wanted to look at these identity categories not in isolation, so not just at women astronomers, not just at Black astronomers, not just at disabled astronomers and their activism, but really how they formed a community. And how they also not just fought for like people of their own sort of in-group, but for a more global community. For instance, through organizations like the International Astronomical Union, so an internationalist scientific institution that has dominated the field of academic astronomy. Even if you just look at these pictures here from the IAU General Assembly in Rome from 100 years ago and the latest one in Cape Town, South Africa, you can see that sort of astronomy has become a lot more diverse as a field. So in Rome 100 years ago, you had mostly white astronomers, mostly European and American astronomers, mostly men. But nowadays, the picture is much more diverse with a lot of astronomers from Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and a lot more women represented here. How have these activists sort of connected with one another? Sort of astronomers who've tried to make the discipline more inclusive. They've networked at conferences. So there have been conferences on women in astronomy, conferences on like inclusive astronomy in general, and then also symposia on like equity, diversity, and inclusion. For instance, a symposium at the National Astronomical Observatory of Japan in 2019. So efforts in different countries. The Space Telescope Science Institute that hosted the first Women in Astronomy conference, by the way, but that's the institution that manages the Hubble Space Telescope and the James Webb Space Telescope that many of you will have heard of. These conferences weren't just were places that sort of brought together people to give papers, but there were often proceedings being published and also manifestos. From the beginning, a lot of these conferences were international. So astronomy really is perhaps per se one of the disciplines that is the most international, because there's no specific country that owns the moon, that owns the sun, that owns the stars. And often, if we want to observe objects continuously, as the Earth turns, different observatories around the world have to collaborate. So, for instance, at the first Women in Astronomy conference in 1992, this was just after the fall of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc. You had American astronomers making great effort to invite Russian female astronomers to come over. This was a time, early 1990s, where it was very, very difficult for Russian scientists to get hard currency, to get US dollars, or to travel to the United States. But astronomers, sort of in shows of solidarity, made that possible. Also, from the recently collapsed German Democratic Republic, you had women coming to Baltimore in order to share experiences, and also share that even in so-called socialist countries, right, maybe women had more rights on paper, but often challenges of hierarchy, challenges of for instance, childcare responsibilities not being equally shared among couples. So a lot of these challenges, they turned out to be the same or very, very similar in Eastern as well as Western countries, in more capitalist as well as socialist countries. And these astronomers, so the Russians, the East Germans, the Americans, they all were able to agree on recommendations, for instance, on how to improve the state of women, the status of women in astronomy worldwide. They formulated a Baltimore Charter for Women in Astronomy that began with what is described here as an ancient Chinese saying, "Women hold up half the sky." It turned out that was not actually such an ancient Chinese saying, but that was actually a quotation from Mao Zedong, so that leader of the Chinese Communist Party. But sort of interestingly, that was something that sort of women astronomers from around the world could agree on. It came with recommendations. Some of these recommendations were perhaps more American in terms of language. So there's talk about affirmative action as a perhaps more American term. But other issues, right? For instance, strong action must be taken to end sexual harassment, but the issue of physical safety, that is really something that astronomers recognize as being universal, and perhaps also like specific to astronomers, right? At least at the time, astronomers used to work in remote areas at night, and so on, often far from cities. So just the physical safety aspect of women was really something that was seen as urgent for everybody in the discipline worldwide. Now, astronomy, right, sort of maybe has the reputation of being sometimes an ivory tower discipline, of somewhat being removed from concerns on Earth. However, astronomers in their activism, they've often represented and tried to sort of change the politics of the day. For instance, during the Cold War, astronomers have tried to bring China, which was excluded from the International Astronomical Union, mainland China that is, back into the organization. I mentioned that that observatories are often at remote locations. So the best observatories you can often find away from cities, high up on mountaintops, where you're very, very close to the heavens, right? Very, very close to the sky. Mountains like Mauna Kea in Hawaii. Well, guess what? Those places where you're very, very close to the heavens, far away from the cities, often these places are also places that are deemed sacred by a lot of indigenous people. So those places like Mauna Kea, where you feel you're so close to the sky, to the stars, that you could almost touch them. these places are also deemed holy by indigenous Hawaiians. So there has been a lot of controversy, for instance, on whether observatories should be built. And well, something that we've probably all experienced in our lifetime, that was here June 2020, that was at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. June 2020, those were the days of the weeks of the George Floyd protests, which probably many of you remember. But now, sort of, you would think astronomers often they concern themselves more with the stars than with the politics of the street. But perhaps because astronomers are so close to physicists, because they are so close to like the military-industrial complex, to power holders, but astronomers have also realized how their own discipline, their own profession has often reflected the hierarchies and power differentials within society. So there have been calls, controversial calls, but nonetheless loud calls from within the astronomical community to participate in strikes for Black lives in society, as well as Black lives in science. So some of these events sort of seem very recent. So George Floyd protests, even some of those protests on Mauna Kea, but there is actually a long history of activism in and political work in physics and astronomy. Some of you may have watched the Oppenheimer movie, which sort of goes into like the politics, the social concerns that people in the physical science community had. But nowadays, at times, the Harvard University is in the news for having legal difficulties with the current US federal government under President Trump. Even though Harvard sort of has long been an elite institution, it has also a history of sort of having had a challenging relationship with the government at times, and being elitist on the one hand, or an elite institution, but also being progressive in other ways. Harlow Shapley was a leading astronomer who headed the Harvard College Observatory, so the main astronomical institution of Harvard University. Nowadays, it's merged with the Smithsonian Astrophysical Observatory to form the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics, a big center in the discipline. Harlow Shapley, like he was a white male professor, but he was somebody who also like encouraged people of various identities. So he had many women who worked at the Harvard Observatory at lower wages, but nonetheless they worked at the Harvard Observatory. They got degrees at Radcliffe College, which was associated with Harvard at a time when women were not allowed to study at Harvard itself. The Harvard Observatory was also known as the Broken English Observatory at the time, on the account of just so many foreigners who were brought in there, including like refugee scientists from Europe who came came during the 1930s from Germany as well as from the Soviet Union. Harlow Shapley himself, he was an astronomer who was interested in galaxies, but he became very, very interested in political work, in part because he saw the purges of intellectual elites and the purges of astronomers in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin in the 1930s. So that really animated him. But nonetheless, even though he sort of opposed Stalinism, he nonetheless became a leftist activist, sort of being part of like Progressive Citizens of America Party, for instance. And Harlow Shapley, he was then an astronomer and also an activist. He supported the creation of UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization. He called for scientists to come out of the laboratory, to be part of like broader politics. And sort of he said that sort of there's a one world of the stars, that that astronomy should be united, that all nations should come together in the study of astronomy. Harlow Shapley, sort of his career stretched over decades, 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, and he, because of sort of his cosmopolitanism, his internationalism, his leftism as well, he then also became suspect, just like somebody like Oppenheimer. So this is an article from the New York Times. Rankin clashes with Dr. Shapley. Un-American committee man charges contempt. Scientist alleges Gestapo hearing. So that's from 1946, where Harlow Shapley, director of the Harvard College Observatory, was called to testify in front of the US Congress, in front of the House Un-American Committee, Un-American Activities Committee, and he considered it like a Gestapo-style interrogation, it perhaps made similar news at the time as nowadays, when sort of Harvard and other officials get questions in the US Congress over quote unquote woke politics. Harlow Shapley himself, he was not intimidated. He sort of kept arguing for international collaboration. Sort of he wanted to transcend nationalism at a time when when there was an enormous amount of nationalist sentiment at the end of World War II. These were notes Shapley published in 1945, so just at the end of World War II. And he said here, some German scholars claim that Copernicus, the astronomer, was a German, and Polish scholars insist that Copernicus was a Pole, but I suggest that both misrepresent the true situation. Copernicus was a terrestrial. And so he argued for astronomers sort of having a larger identity than just tied to one specific nation state. He also, Harlow Shapley, headed an international commission for the creation of International Observatory. It's just at a time when the world became very much divided into East and West in the late 1940s and early 1950s. These international observatories, they did not immediately come into being, but you can see a trajectory from there to some of the great observatories that we have today, which are very, very expensive international collaborations. So for instance, the SCAR Observatory, the Square Kilometer Array Observatory, as the word Square Kilometer Array suggests, a huge, enormous instrument, or the James Webb Space Telescope, a hugely expensive scientific instrument. And sometimes the James Webb Space Telescope is maybe sort of seen as an American instrument because it's named after an American former NASA head, but it is a collaboration between NASA, the European Space Agency, and partners in Canada and Japan and elsewhere. So one way sort of astronomers have tried to sort of push for internationalism is through international observatories. The International Astronomical Union has also supported the exchange of individual astronomers, so astronomers crossing borders. So here this is 1950s. In the 1950s, UNESCO offering fund enabling astronomers to travel across borders to access different observatories. This work sort of still continues, where you have astronomers going from east to west, from west to east, from south to north, and vice versa. Now you would think, well, UNESCO supporting this kind of international astronomical work, you feel that maybe sounds fairly unpolitical, right? So that's that's like travel grants for scholars, doesn't sound too controversial. Well, But let's not forget that UNESCO itself, the funder of these awards, has become controversial in the United States, among other places. So this is news from 2025, for instance, in USA Today, about Trump withdrawing the US from a woke UNESCO program again. So for the second time after the first Trump administration, America is not part of the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And of course, we also know about the difficulties of issuing visas nowadays for various kinds of people, including scientists. So we've had professional astronomers like Harlow Shapley at elite institutions being engaged in this kind of work, but we also see work at the grassroots. So astronomy is also distinguished by having a very venerable amateur tradition. So until today, there are countless amateur astronomers around the world who like study the sky and often make discoveries, right? So often discover comets, discover asteroids, and other celestial phenomena. One leading astronomer is Mike Simmons, founder of Astronomers Without Borders, an organization. Here you can see him in Iran. So he's an American astronomer, amateur astronomer. He's Jewish, but even though he's American and even though he's Jewish, that didn't prevent him from traveling to Iran multiple times and connecting with astronomers there. Here you can see him at a telescope making workshop at the University of Tehran. He also collaborated with Iranian astronomers on building bridges through the sky, sort of arguing that we are one people, all of humanity are one people, we have one sky, and astronomers are without borders. And he makes the argument that, well, if Venus appears above Iran, well, hours later, that same planet, Venus, will appear over Texas, for instance. So the sky, the planets, the stars, then having a capacity to unify people. And here, Mike Simmons and one Iranian colleague, Babak Tafreshi, then showed photographs of how the same objects in the sky appeared over different monuments across the world, showing both cultural diversity as well as a unity of astronomy. So I talked a lot about identity politics, about activism, gender activism, internationalist activism, and so on, and how these are often connected. Sometimes, right, this kind of identity politics is being accused of being divisive, right, where it's like us versus them, where sometimes it is seen as sort of a zero-sum game, where if women gain, men lose, or if people of color gain, white people would lose, right? This is sometimes the accusation of by conservative critics of this identity politics. However, astronomers have also tried to offer sort of a kind of an identity that is not divisive, but that is in fact comprehensive and can be universal, right? That we are all living on one planet, right? That's sort of our fundamental identity that we share. Essentially, in the wider cosmos, we all share the same address. That's Earth. And in some ways, right, with climate change, with things that happen on our planet on a global scale, we share the same fate. So what happens to the planet happens to all of us. It could happen to all of us. So hopefully astronomers can then also give us an optimistic view of, yes, it is maybe possible for us to unite people. If the sky is united, then maybe all of us can be united too. And well, and maybe the history of astronomy, the history of activism can also give us further optimism, right? That yes, we live in these very, very challenging times of where of a lot of divisions in American politics and other politics, a lot of political violence as well, assassinations, and so on. But sort of history obviously reminds us that in some ways we've been there before, right? We've survived the 1960s with an age of political assassinations, right? Think about John F. Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King, right? But we've overcome sort of times of the Gestapo, of McCarthyism, of fascism as well, and astronomers and science sort of have survived these challenging times in the past. So hopefully there's something here that we can learn from or can take inspiration from as we sort of look into the years ahead. Thank you so much again, and I'll leave you with that Vulcan greeting from Star Trek: live long and prosper, everybody. Thank you.